Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Ben Hart here. I've been wanting for some time to do a video on my assessment of Nick Fuentes. And I first want to start out with what I like about Nick Fuentes. I will then get into my critique of Nick, my issues with Nick. Nick Fuentes is among the best I've ever seen at extemporaneous speaking. Nick has a 3-hour live streaming podcast every night where he just riffs with perfectly formed sentences and coherent thoughts. He's an amazing talent and a formidable debater. He's a lot of fun to listen to. And Nick, if you just happen to stumble across this podcast and want to talk about what I cover here, I'd love to sit down with you and talk. We only live about 15 minutes apart from each other in a western suburb in Chicago. I can pop on over to your place, or you can come over to our place. And before I get into my issues with Nick and my critique of Nick Fuentes, let's hit on some Nick Fuentes highlights. We'll get into Nick Fuentes' brutal takedown of Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens in a bit, but first, a little backstory on that. Nick is just 27 years old. He's probably been the strongest anti-Israel voice on the right for the past 9 years. For years, he was banned from every social media platform, banned from YouTube, banned from Facebook, banned from Twitter, banned from Twitch, banned pretty much from everywhere. And just for the record, I'm against banning anybody, left or right, unless they're inciting violence, threatening people, harassing people, stalking people, or conducting illegal activity. Nick was certainly not doing any of this. Nick was banned because of his ideas, some of which I strongly disagree with. I will say, however, that I do find myself agreeing with about 80%, at least directionally, with what Nick is saying. We're both America first. I love the fact that Donald Trump transformed the Republican Party into a populist America first party of the working class. I think both Nick and I agree on this. So Nick was banned by big tech for years from all the social media platforms. He was put on a no-fly list by the Biden regime because he attended January 6th, though he never entered the Capitol building. He was also debanked, wasn't allowed to have a bank account. All this by the age of 22. Then Rumble came along and allowed him to have a show. And then Elon Musk bought Twitter, turned it into X, and allowed Nick back on Twitter, back on X. And Nick blew up pretty quickly because he's so articulate and compelling to listen to, and because what he was saying was resonating with a lot of people, particularly with disaffected young white males. But surprisingly, Nick has a strong following among young black males, despite the fact that Nick identifies himself as a white identitarian or as a white nationalist who is strongly critical of American black culture, particularly gangster rap and hood culture, glorification of the hood culture and violence and so on. Nick sees American black culture as largely dysfunctional today, and many American blacks are agreeing with Nick on this. So what's happened in recent years is that Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens have joined Nick and become outspoken critics of Israel. And the three kind of became competitors in the same marketplace. And then Nick started saying some pretty tough things about Candace, said that she didn't really know anything, was just factually wrong about a lot of things, getting a lot of details wrong, and it become kind of an embarrassment to the anti-Israel side. That was Nick's view.
And she's calling them the Bolshevists, and she says that she gets all the details wrong about that. And then she says Stalin was Jewish. Stalin was not Jewish. And then she says Ataturk was secretly Jewish. Ataturk was not secretly Jewish. And then, but I didn't say anything. I said, whatever. I said, oh, well, not everyone's perfect. I said, yeah, it's not really a good look, but, she's learning. I said she's going to get on the ball eventually. So I didn't say anything. I held my tongue, even though that was not really a good look, okay? You can't really go hard like that and stake the reputation of you and everybody on this and then, get it wrong really severely over and over. She's talking about, all this stuff that, it just doesn't even really make any sense. But then lately she's been saying this Frankist thing. And the difference between me and her, one, I'm a really good researcher. Two, I really know what the fuck I'm talking about because I've been doing this a long time.
And Nick is absolutely right about Candace, and I've done a couple of deep dive videos on Candace's absurd claims. Candace thinks dinosaurs weren't real, and she's 50-50 on whether the Earth is round or flat.
You don't believe dinosaurs are real.
Yeah. So this is the funny one. So this is one of the ones where I'm like, gut. I was like, dinosaurs, that seems pretty fake and gay. They're just roaming the planet. And it is the case that dinosaur bones, for whatever reason, are always just found by the paleontologists. Like, it's not like you and me walking outside. I'm like, hey, a dinosaur bone.
And a woman messaged me about the flat earth theory, which I had never looked into. And she sent me all these links and she's like, you need to look into this, blah, blah, blah. And it's antithetical to the Bible and all of this stuff.
And of course, he pushed me on this, and he was talking about the earth curvature and science. And I said to him, listen, I'm not a flat earther. I'm not a round earther. You must come to terms with the fact that NASA and space missions have always been this big and gay. You just weren't alive for the original ones. And you need to learn the history of NASA, of the Apollo programs, which were occult and satanic. It was literally meant to be an antichrist movement to make people believe in man. I'm telling you, space has always been exceedingly fake and gay.
And you can find my video on all that here titled, What Happened to Candace Owens, who I used to be a big fan of until she careened off into La La Land. She's also going to lose that defamation lawsuit from Brigitte Macron. Not only did Candace do 8 videos on how she thinks Brigitte Macron is a biological male transgendered to female, she claims that President Emmanuel Macron is actually married to his transgendered father.
Is there a chance that Brigitte Macron, some of you asked, is actually the father of Emmanuel Macron?
No. Brigitte Macron has 3 children from a previous marriage to this guy. 2 of her daughters look almost exactly like Brigitte. And she's already won 2 defamation lawsuits on this topic against Candace's primary source. Nick would have loved to have welcomed Candace Owens to the anti-Israel team, but she's too embarrassing to be on his team because she just gets everything wrong, including just basic history, and just makes stuff up for clicks.
That's Macron. He's going to make this declaration in September. Other people are trying to convince us that he is the devil. Candace Owens wants us to believe that he married his dad, that his wife is a man, and not only any man, but that man is his dad.
And here's what Nick says about Candace's theory that Charlie Kirk was killed by Israel.
Whether Israel was behind the killing or not, we have to get to the bottom of this alleged payment. And I would implore Candace Owens, release all the receipts. You have to release all the receipts immediately. Don't play games. Do not play games. If you have receipts, you need to release them fast. Do not drag it out for the sake of your show. You know, I watched her show today and I was honestly disappointed. She promised receipts. We have seen no receipts from Max Blumenthal or Candace Owens. We've seen a lot of hearsay, unnamed sources, anonymous friends of Charlie Kirk. If Netanyahu offered $150 million and he turned it down, we need to see the documentation, if there is such a thing. If Charlie Kirk sent a letter to Netanyahu resisting his advance, we need to know the contents of that letter. If there is information to the contrary, we need to see it immediately. You cannot withhold that information. I did not know Charlie. I never worked for Turning Point or Daily Wire or Fox News, so I do not have this privileged insider information from the Jewish Club. But if anybody has that information, it must be released. If you have receipts, you can't play games and say, we've got the documentation. You better release it or else. No, doesn't work that way. You need to put the information out. Otherwise, it's irresponsible. And we need to get to the bottom of this. And by the way, we all need to demand that our Trump government, they have to get to the bottom of this. If it was Israel, if it was leftists, we need to know what threat we face. If Charlie Kirk is being gunned down for not taking money from a foreign state to support their war, that's a problem. If Charlie Kirk got gunned down by a terrorist cell of insane left-wing trannies, we need to know that too.
What I like about Nick is he's intellectually honest, and Candace has just become an embarrassment to his side, to his cause. Candace got her feathers ruffled by Nick's attacks, and so Candace had Nick on her show. Now, Candace wasn't really interested in having a genuine discussion. She was just ticked off that Nick was calling her out on her constant errors, her constant misstatements of facts. So what she did here was more just try to ambush him with his more controversial statements. And she spent a lot of time just scolding him. But Nick handled himself very well. And here she is scolding Nick on not yet being married.
Do you attend the Mass?
I do.
Like, do you go every Sunday?
I do, yeah.
Okay, so you're like a committed Catholic. Then obviously, like, the perspectives on family. I mean, I personally, and this would be me lecturing, but I just feel like you really have no idea who you are until you start a family. And whether that means just marriage, some people who are struggling to have children, okay, fine. But there's such a growth that happens because of that I think it informs your beliefs in so many ways. And I think that was a huge turning point for me. Like, I wonder if I had been pressed with everything that happened last year, if I didn't have like the unshaken faith and my family, what would I have done? And sometimes when I see the things that you say, I do think, okay, he doesn't take into account family. Like, it's just Nick. Nick is in his own world, which can be, I think, a quite selfish perspective, which is fine. That's what you're saying. You like being selfish is another way to say what you just said. I like being selfish and I don't want to give of myself to somebody else. But
Well, I also think there's something selfless involved, which is to say, I could go and start a family and drag them into a world of mine, which is pretty chaotic. I mean, is this really the kind of a lifestyle? If I'm banned on everything and I can't make a living, I'm banned from banking, I'm banned from credit card processing, I'm getting doxxed, people are showing up to my house trying to kill me, things like that.
And yes, this assassination attempt on Nick was both real and wild, absolutely insane, and almost completely ignored by the media, so very few people even know about this. On December 18th, 2024, this man in a motorcycle helmet, armed with a pistol and a crossbow, arrived at Nick's door while he was live streaming and called out Nick's name. It's all right here on video. This man had committed a triple murder earlier that day. This man by the name of John R. Lyons. And here he is ringing the doorbell, trying to turn the doorknob and force his way in. He yells, "Yo, Nick!" And police responded to reports of this man with a gun. And this Lyons character fled on foot when he heard police coming. He then killed 2 dogs at a nearby home and was shot in a shootout with police. But the media barely covered the story, or if they did, they were dismissive of it, using phrases like far-right extremist Nick Fuentes claims someone tried to kill him. No, not claims. It's all on video and described by police in official police reports. You really can't hate the media enough. It's impossible to hate the propaganda news enough.
And what's more, I mean, let's also get, I also don't appreciate the lecture. You don't know me, so I know you're married. I know you're older than me, but you don't know me. You don't know my life. You don't know my situation. I don't think you're in a position to give me advice, especially as a woman, honestly. I don't think women, this is something in the right wing. We say we're anti-feminist, and then women go around telling men what to do who are not their husbands. And, I don't really buy into that ideologically, but that's besides the point. My life has been tumultuous from the very beginning. From the time I turned 18, people were coming for my neck and trying to get me, and I was kicked out of college. And then, once you're branded as an anti-Semite, before it became cool or popular, can't get a job, can't make a living, get banned from PayPal, all this kind of stuff. That's a very difficult environment to try to have a dating life. What do? I go out on Tinder, I go to a bar, and I say, hey, I'm a neo-Nazi Nick Fuentes that the ADL is writing articles about every day. I'm going to start a dating profile on Tinder. People are going to screenshot that, mess with me in all kinds of ways. It's a very difficult predicament, actually, for me, because I took on basically a huge sacrifice at the beginning. And I don't know that you really appreciate that enough. I think that you're somebody who, you had a career in politics for as long as I was fighting a battle. You were at Daily Wire with a contract. You're at Turning Point. You're making good money. You're doing book deals. You're part of this thing that I'm criticizing and paying a very heavy price for at a time when no one's saying those things, when it's very unpopular. And it's not to say that I'm a victim, because I did it willingly and I love it and I would do it again. But it is to say that, you and I have lived very different lives. And, it's easy, I think, for you to say you had your husband, have your kids, you got your ducks in a row, made quite a bit of money. Then you discovered the truth, and then you went out on a limb. And it's not to say you didn't make sacrifices and it wasn't a risk, and it paid off. You're doing great now, and I congratulate you. But with me, there was no calculation. I mean, I almost want to say I was 17. What's your excuse? I was 17, and I woke up, and I went balls to the wall, bucket of ice cold water, as you say. I made a lot of enemies, and maybe that wasn't wise. but I told the truth and I took on an extremely heavy cost for my personal life. It basically has made it so that I can't have a personal life. I don't even have many friends. Forget about, dating women. I can't even really have a lot of male friends because there's such an incentive to betray me, to turn your back on me, because there are people that are being paid to attack me all the time on Twitter or for information about me, things like that. So, it's something like everything else that I'm figuring out one step at a time, just like my show. And, when I get banned from something, whether or not I'll be able to have a family and kids and what that'll look like. But I mean, it's a little more complicated, I think, than maybe you understand.
The internet generally acted very positively to Nick's appearance on Candace's show and negatively to Candace's scolding of Nick and her ambush questions. So then Candace and Tucker Carlson got together and did a show on Nick, apparently in an attempt to give Candace a second swing at Nick because her ambush style of interview with Nick had not gone over well on the internet. And what Tucker and Candace were trying to do here is squash an emerging competitor in the anti-Israel space with mockery and personal attacks. So let's dip into that. And then we'll get into Nick's epic response.
The only reason I know who he is because someone sent me a video a few years ago of him attacking me. And I was like, so I'm looking at this. And I'm like, well, first of all, this kid's really talented, like legit. And I can assess that just having done the job for so long. So I was like, wow, lots of talent, native talent. And he's attacking my dad as a CIA, his dad's in the CIA or whatever. And I'm like, well, that's no, untrue. Then my father dies and I learn actually, was involved in that world. I was completely shocked by it. So no one has to believe me, but that's just a fact.
Right.
This was in March of this year. And I'm like, well, how the hell would this child from Chicago, my dad was 84 when he passed. Like, who does this guy know who my dad is? And like, he's in the intelligence world. How would he know that? And I
Wait, so that was his critique of you? Because I didn't see it.
Someone just sent me this video and was like, you can't believe anything Carlson says because his father was in the CIA and he's a CIA working on behalf of the CIA. Well, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, and I actually feel emotional in my anger towards CIA. And I think that comes out on the air quite regularly.
Right.
And so the idea that I'm working for the CIA is like deranged. Anyway, like, who is this kid exactly?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's just an accident that the guy exclusively goes after people who are in roughly the same. Is it possible that this is like David Duke? David Duke, every time I had a new show, David Duke would endorse my show. I don't know, who the hell is David Duke? Well, David Duke is obviously part of a campaign to discredit people on the right, obviously.
Mm.
And I think it's very obvious that Nick Fuentes is exactly the same. Doesn't mean everything he says is false. It doesn't mean he's not talented. He's enormously talented. Doesn't mean he's a bad person. I'm not attacking him personally, but he is clearly part of a campaign to discredit non-crazy right voices. That's obvious to me. I've been around a long time. I know it when I see it.
Yeah, and I will say I don't understand it. We were very kind to him. Like, I truly, like, we almost said, like, we felt maybe he was a bit lonely. We should invite him back for dinner. I mean, that's how good of an experience I had.
It's clearly.
And then it was a 180. So it's either A, it's being driven from like a little boy insecurity, and he just was so worried that he like just went on the attack because he doesn't know how to have normal relations after being banned everywhere.
Well, I think that could
be one element.
The angry gay kid thing going on. Yeah.
Or it's what you're saying, where he does this, he's lying to everybody and pretending that things are one way when it's not. I can say
why is he attacking Joe Kent, who, Joe Kent worked as a CIA contractor, paramilitary contractor. He was in the U.S. military for years fighting our neocon wars.
Now the quick backstory on Tucker's mention of Joe Kent is this. Joe Kent was a conservative running for Congress in 2022 in Washington state. And part of his platform was no more endless American wars in the Middle East. And Joe Kent was endorsed in the Republican primary by Nick Fuentes, who offered to help Joe Kent. And indeed, Joe Kent was solicitous of Nick's support during the Republican primary. And Nick's support helped Joe Kent win the GOP primary, because this helped identify Joe Kent to GOP primary voters as the conservative in the race. But when the media began reporting of Nick's support for Joe Kent during the general election, Joe Kent disavowed any connection with Nick. He called Nick an anti-Semite and a bunch of other names. So then Nick turned against Joe Kent, telling his followers that Joe Kent was a former CIA contractor, which actually was true. So therefore, a fake conservative, a deep stater, and a tool for the military-industrial complex, and so could not be trusted to be a non-interventionist in Middle East wars. So Joe Kent lost a very close race to the Democrat. And this caused a lot of conservatives to be angry with Nick Fuentes, understandably, because he cost Republicans a congressional seat with his attacks on Joe Kent during the general election.
And his wife was killed in Syria in one of those wars. Joe Kent is the single most sincere critic, and I would say the one with the most credibility in the United States to say this foreign policy is bad. It killed my wife. I was a part of it. Joe Kent is actually someone the CIA doesn't like at all because he understands how it operates. And for Nick Fuentes, who's like some child from Chicago, to go after him specifically, one congressional seat in Washington State.
That is random.
It's not random, though. It's the opposite of random. Joe Kent was number one on the list of people they wanted to knock off, people who believe in our neocon foreign policy. They wanted Joe Kent out because he could stand up and say, I actually know. I've got the receipts. My wife was killed in Syria. You had to take that guy out. And Nick Fuentes, this child, this weird little gay kid in his basement in Chicago, is participating in a super PAC to bump off Joe Kent. Like, I've been around this my whole life. I know what that is. It's just an organized effort.
Yeah.
And he also did the thing that David Duke always did, including to me, which is be like, oh, yeah, it's my friend. And everyone's like, oh, Tucker Carlson's been endorsed by David Duke. I've been making like the anti-racist argument my whole life.
Right.
Like, I'm not for David Duke. Do I think David Duke is right when he's against affirmative action? You bet I do. But I'm not for David Duke. But David Duke would try to discredit people by hugging them. And that's exactly what Fuentes did. He goes out there, meet all these people, show up, hi, I'm Nick Fuentes. Can I get my picture with you? That's a campaign to destroy credible voices on the right. And Fuentes is part of it. And I know I'm inviting endless trouble by saying this because, this is a kid with a lot of spare time, but it's just a fact. And I've seen it a lot.
Yeah.
And I, you can believe me or not, but I know what I'm talking about.
And here was Nick's epic response that blew up on the internet.
I'm being accused of being the CIA by Peter Thiel's best boys, by Tucker Carlson with his daddy. Tucker Carlson's, and you know what? Here's the other thing. Tucker Carlson said I'm a weird gay kid in the basement. Yeah, and I'm from Chicago. You're right. Well, okay, you're not right about all of that. But I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Tucker Carlson says, I have so many trust funds, I never have to work. Tucker went to a $45,000 per year private high school, then a $45,000 per year selective Ivy League school in New England. Tucker Carlson's daddy was a Reagan appointee. And then, after years of bragging about being an elite, bragging about being so out of touch and so rich, now he's going to be the spokesperson for all the white people. Now he's going to roll up his sleeves. I just like to hunt and fish in my log cabin. I care about Klarna and credit card debt. But then when it comes to me, I'm one of the real disaffected white people. You want to talk about me and them? I am them. He says Nick Fuentes is leading all of the disaffected young white men. I am a disaffected young white man. I was a precocious, intelligent, young white college student who went to Boston University, who was pro-Trump and red-pilled by Trump and animated by Trump's message of America first. And I asked questions about Israel, and I was punished for it. I did it years before Tucker Carlson started talking about Israel last year. And I sacrificed, and I was targeted by the ADL, by the SPLC, by the federal government, by the conservative movement that both Candace and Tucker were a part of. Candace and Tucker had nothing to say about Israel until it became unavoidable last year. Not popular, but unavoidable. And now they want to gatekeep me out and do this personality attack and say I'm a bitter loser in my basement from Chicago. I'm a kid from Chicago. And they slipped up there because they forgot for 1 second that they're pretending to be the spokesperson for exactly that kind of person. Tucker's mask slipped, and he forgot for a minute that for 8 years he's been pretending to care about the plight of weird kids in their parents' basement who are broke and didn't go to an Ivy League school, living in cities that don't matter like Chicago, not like Washington, D.C. or L.A. or New York. And that's why he had such disdain and contempt for me in that moment. Between the personality attacks, he's lonely, he's weird, he lives in a basement. I'm sorry, did you guys forget that that's your target audience that you're trying to pander to? Did you forget that for 2 seconds? And I'm the inauthentic person? I am that person. I am a spokesman for the disaffected white man because I am one, and you two are not. Candace Owens got married to British royalty worth $200 million after meeting him for 2 weeks on Zoom. What the fuck is even that about? And Tucker Carlson's dad ran the CIA's propaganda empire fighting the Soviet Union. He went and fought with the Contras when he was in college. When I was in college, I was doing a webcam show in my friend's dorm room criticizing Israel. So who's the CIA cutout? Who's the inauthentic one? Who's the crazy, hateful one? I would never describe a well-meaning young white person who's trying to get ahead as a weird kid in his basement from Chicago. And what is that supposed to mean? What is wrong with being from Chicago? What is wrong with being weird? What is wrong with living in your basement? That's a lot of people because of the problems you claim to care about. Tucker's at Turning Point USA extolling the predatory nature of usury and how it's preventing young white men from getting homes. And then the week after says, you're in your mom's basement. So which is it? So which is it? Do you care about Klarna and people going into debt to order pizzas and home ownership being impossible? Or do you think that's a contemptible, low-status thing to be ridiculed and mocked? Who's pandering here exactly? Because that wasn't you. You were born to the Swanson family fortune and your daddy who ran the CIA. You know, my dad didn't even graduate college. My dad worked for the tollway. His dad died of a drug overdose in the 70s. My mother's father was a garbage man in Chicago, and he committed suicide. He was a veteran of World War II. Who's the CIA cutout? Who's the poser? Who is America? I am America. Chicago is America. That's an American story. I didn't go to Yale Law School and suck Peter Thiel's dick and then get a sinecure at a venture capital firm advising Rebecca Mercer. That's your biographical credibility? How many of these disaffected white people that love Trump because he's racist went to Yale Law School and got plucked out by Peter Thiel, whoever he even is? Peter Thiel with his fixation with the Antichrist, this homosexual who's involved with the CIA, who wants to live forever and govern the world with AI. Yeah, that's really relatable. That's really relatable. Do another show with him and Curtis Yarvin. Do another show. Do the 47th show with J.D. Vance. It is insulting, and it is insulting to everybody's intelligence for Tucker to sit there and say he doesn't know his dad is in the CIA, for him to say that I'm in the CIA. What a joke. What a sick joke. Especially after everything that's happened to me. And unlike what Candace Owens says, she says, what happened to him when he was 18? What happened to me is ongoing. Okay? Unlike Candace Owens and Tucker, I never got a contract with Ben Shapiro and Rupert Murdoch. I was on Maker Support. I was on Patreon. I was on D Live. I had to fight for everything I have. I didn't get $1 million contract from Turning Point. I didn't get $20 million from Fox News. My daddy didn't get me a job in Arkansas. So ridiculous.
I'm not sure why Tucker thought it was a good idea to take on Nick Fuentes, especially just to mock Nick without actually taking on Nick's ideas and views, just to kind of dismiss him with ad hominem attacks. Tucker even accused Nick of being a plant by the feds to discredit conservatives. Tucker and Candace, with their massive audiences, thought they could just crush Nick like a gnat with mockery. Wow, were they wrong? Big mistake for them. So Nick really blew up after this. He had gotten pretty big anyway, but he got really big after this. Nick Fuentes is a formidable character, and he did a great job of exposing Tucker as something of a fraud. Tucker claimed in his discussion with Candace that he learned from Nick Fuentes that his father was in the CIA, that Tucker's father was in the CIA. But actually, it turns out that Tucker had spoken in the past often about how his father was in the CIA, so he did not learn that from Nick Fuentes. And Nick Fuentes, of course, called out Tucker on that. Okay, now let me get into my critique of Nick Fuentes on substance. Because as I said, there's a lot I like about Nick Fuentes. He's a brilliant guy. My goal here is to always state Nick's views as fairly and accurately as possible, not create a straw man by grabbing some of his most controversial quotes. Many of his controversial quotes are intended as kind of shock humor. But let's start by taking his views on Israel and the Jews. It's Nick's view that Israel essentially controls U.S. foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East. Nick believes that the United States is Israel's puppet when it comes to the Middle East, fights wars on behalf of Israel in the Middle East when it's not in America's interest to do that. He also notes that Israel's lobby inside the United States is pretty massive, pointing primarily to AIPAC with its $150 million annual budget and the Anti-Defamation League with its $50 million annual budget. Nick also points out that the Jews, the Jewish people, dominate America's key institutions of influence: the media, Hollywood, finance, academia, law, and government. Let's hear Nick on this in an interview he did with Glenn Greenwald.
You talked about a lot of the areas of agreement that you have with people like Matt Walsh and people even like Charlie Kirk, all the kind of standard right-wing items of like immigration and closed borders and the necessity to protect religious values and the war against it and all of that. And yet, obviously, one of the reasons you were hostile to people like Charlie Kirk and to some extent Matt Walsh and others is because of the issue that you emphasized, I think quite persuasively, is more important than all of those, without which nothing can be changed, which is the stranglehold that Israel and its loyalists inside the United States, through what John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt called the Israel lobby, has on American politics. Why is it that you consider that issue to be maybe not paramount, but like a first order importance that has to be fixed before anything else is possible?
Well, because on some level, if I represent nativism, nationalism, we're against immigration, we're in favor of all these things, it really comes down to sovereignty. I mean, the fundamental question behind all of the issues, I would say at the center of it, is whether America is an independent nation, whether its politics are free from foreign influence, whether it's real Americans making the decisions. The whole premise of the government, of our government, is of, by, and for the American people. And so if there is this giant foreign influence lobby with its allies in America that is at the center, preventing the people from having sovereignty, having independence, from self-representation and self-governance, it's sort of a contradiction in terms. That's sort of like the ever-present political reality, is that before our government, which is, theoretically supposed to represent us, before the government can move or make decisions, it first must consult a foreign nation or satisfy the demands of a foreign nation. That is then the preeminent issue. That's kind of the roadblock that's standing between everything that we're doing. And the disagreement between somebody like myself and Matt Walsh, or even for that matter, somebody like Jared Taylor, or for that matter, V. Dare, many of the immigration restrictionists on the white nationalist side, the more pro-white side of the right wing, they believe that we can have sort of like a grand bargain, that they take sort of an accommodationist position. There are, of course, the pro-Israel side is very in tune with the far right in Europe, the far right in America. In many ways, they fund and produce the far right in America. And so there's this viewpoint that if we don't upset the apple cart with Israeli influence in America, the Israelis that control our country will let us have immigration restriction. And I guess my chief disagreement is it's up to us what our decisions are. It shouldn't be up to them to grant these concessions or grant better living conditions. In a sense, I'm kind of saying the original message, which is give me freedom or give me death. I will actually trade a worse quality of life or even my political enemies having control as long as they're native, as long as they're coming from America, rather than being influenced by a foreign country. And that comes from a disagreement in principle. So to me, it all comes back to independence and sovereignty. For them, it comes back to some vague Christian values, whatever, ideological conservatism. So to me, that's the big disagreement. That's why I think it's the preeminent issue.
Now, Glenn Greenwald is Jewish, but he is very skeptical of Israel as well. So he kind of shares Nick Fuentes' views on Israel. Nick is often described as anti-Semitic. He himself says he's anti-Semitic, though I think actually in a more joking way, more for shock value. Sometimes he even calls himself the spokesman for the anti-Semitic wing of the right. Now, I'm quite sure I know that Nick Fuentes does not dislike Jewish people as individuals. He's just not a fan of the Jewish tribe as a whole. He believes that Jews have massively disproportionate influence and power over American politics, even though Jews only make up 2.4% of the American people. And when Nick uses the phrase, the Jews, it does come across as a bit jarring, as kind of anti-Semitic. But Judaism is an ethno-religion. It's a religion that says the Jews are God's chosen people, that God chose this race of people. Christians, by contrast, believe that God chose no race of people. God saves those who believe in Jesus Christ, regardless of their race. Plus, in point of fact, it's not racist to say Jews any more than it's racist to say whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asians. It's just descriptive of an ethnic group of people. Now, in general, I do say the Jewish people. Sounds less jarring than the Jews. The phrases mean the same thing. Nick usually says the Jews, and I'm sure he does that on purpose, partially for shock value. And I certainly agree that Jewish people wield enormous power and influence in America, even though just 2.4% of the population. I would argue that that's because for thousands of years, Jewish culture has valued learning, study, and hard work. Jewish people have also always been a minority in the lands that they inhabited, and were targets of persecution for thousands of years, culminating in the Holocaust, where Hitler exterminated 45% of the Jewish people from the face of the earth. And the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust became very tough. So combine their love of learning, study, ferocious work ethic, and plus an incredible resilience and toughness, and that's a pretty good formula for success. And the success that the Jewish people always seem to have, almost no matter what the level of persecution, almost no matter where they live, does create a lot of envy, which fueled the Holocaust and fuels anti-Semitism through the ages and even up until this day. So yeah, because of their work ethic, their intelligence, their love of learning and study, the Jewish people rise in pretty much every profession, and they have enormous influence. But Nick Fuentes also has disproportionate influence because he's smart. He's just one person, but he has millions of followers because he's compelling, because he's smart. Now, I certainly agree with Nick that it's ridiculous that the Israel lobby in America, most notably AIPAC, is exempted from the Foreign Agents Registration Act, meaning AIPAC does not have to disclose that it's acting as an agent of Israel with its political contributions. So yeah, that's ridiculous. I don't know why they're exempt. AIPAC and the Jewish lobby should have to follow the same laws as everybody else, should have to disclose the fact that they're acting as agents for Israel. And I actually favor banning all foreign powers from engaging in any political activity inside the United States. This includes foreign money that flows into nonprofit organizations that engage in voter registration drives, voter turnout campaigns, lobbying operations, or that try to influence U.S. policy by setting up phony think tanks and producing bogus studies. I'm for banning all of that. I'm for banning all foreign money coming into American educational institutions. Between 2015 and 2024, Harvard received $1.4 billion from foreign countries, including $150 million from China. That should not be allowed, in my opinion. No foreign money should fund America's educational institutions. Foreign money equals foreign propaganda. What exactly did China get from Harvard in exchange for this $150 million from China? You can be sure that wasn't free. You can be sure there was a quid pro quo for that money. Probably produced a bunch of bogus studies and research in exchange for that money. I also don't think adversaries of the United States should be sending students into these schools. I think that should be banned. So I'm absolutely 100% on board with Nick Fuentes on that. I'm not even sure that's his position. Maybe I go farther than Nick Fuentes on that. America's sovereignty must be protected. But I would counter with a few facts that call into question Israel's power over the United States. In the mid-1980s, a naval intelligence analyst named Jonathan Pollard was arrested and sentenced to life in prison for spying on the United States on behalf of Israel. Now, since Israel is an ally of the United States, I thought that was an incredibly harsh penalty, life in prison. Jonathan Pollard was sending Israel U.S. intelligence about Israel's enemies, including the Soviet Union, terrorist groups, and Israel's surrounding Islamic enemies. Israel is also very upset about Pollard's life sentence. And we were plenty ticked off with Israel for spying on the United States. And this suggests to me that the United States is no puppet of Israel. Pollard was released from prison by Barack Obama after serving 29 years. But if the Israel lobby was so powerful, if the United States is a puppet of Israel, Jonathan Pollard would not have served this amount of time, not 29 years, probably wouldn't have served any time, would have received a slap on the wrist since Israel is not really trying to hurt the United States with its spying, was just trying to find out what we knew about Israel's enemies. Israel wanted to fill in its intelligence gaps, wanted to find out what we knew about Israel's enemies that Israel didn't know. But we sent a message with the Pollard life sentence that this kind of behavior by Israel will not be tolerated by the United States. I would also add that if the Jewish lobby is really as powerful as Nick claims, why didn't Kamala Harris pick Josh Shapiro, the popular Jewish governor of Pennsylvania, as her vice presidential running mate in 2024? Everybody expected her to pick Shapiro. Made sense, Pennsylvania being a battleground state. He was the obvious choice for her. Probably would have enabled her to win Pennsylvania. Well, the reason she didn't pick him is the growing Muslim voting bloc, especially in the battleground state of Michigan, also in Minnesota. The Muslim population is exploding in America, and it's becoming an increasingly important voting bloc. Muslims have a lot of babies. American Jews and American whites are not having a lot of babies. So it's not going to be that long before America is swamped by Muslims, simply because the Muslims are having a lot more babies than we are. Jewish influence over American politics used to be a lot more important than it is today. Back in the 1980s and even up to the early 2000s, the Jewish neocons had much more sway over U.S. foreign policy than they do today. In the Reagan and Bush administrations, for example, neocons like Richard Pearl and Elliott Abrams had a lot of influence. Henry Kissinger, a Jewish immigrant, was Richard Nixon's Secretary of State and National Security Advisor at the same time. Kissinger was arguably the most powerful Secretary of State since World War II. And conservatives were happy to welcome the neocons into the conservative tent because many of them had been former communists but had turned against communism. And I'm referring here specifically to Jewish intellectuals like Norman Podhoretz, whose magazine Commentary was very influential. Also, Irving Kristol, who headed up an academic journal called The Public Interest. These were two former communists who had become anti-communist. And they did play a big role in installing their protégés into Republican administrations, men like Richard Pearl and Elliott Abrams, who were very influential in the Reagan and Bush administrations. The Jewish wing of the conservative movement also got a writer named Joe Sobran fired for National Review when he started writing against Israel, or at least questioning America's financial support for Israel. Sam Francis, who I worked with when I was at the Heritage Foundation in the 1980s, was also pushed out of the Heritage Foundation because of his skepticism about Israel. And Pat Buchanan, former columnist, former Nixon speechwriter, was ejected from establishment conservative circles for his similar skepticism of Israel. Nick Fuentes often mentions Joe Sobran and Sam Francis as writers he admires, as well as Pat Buchanan. I knew all three very well. I had many dinners with Joe Sobran and Sam Francis. My dad and Pat Buchanan were good friends. Both wrote speeches for Richard Nixon. My dad and I would have dinners with Pat Buchanan and his wife Shelley. So I also knew Pat Buchanan pretty well, not as well as I knew Joe Sobran and Sam Francis. So I knew their position very well on Israel. And their position was basically this: America would be having a lot fewer problems in the Middle East if we had, along with the Allied powers during World War II, had not essentially plopped Israel into the middle of the Arab world, displacing about 700,000 Palestinians and Arabs. We might not have had the 9/11 attack, for example. That was their view. They were also highly skeptical of U.S. military adventurism in the Middle East. They opposed the Iraq War and the neoconservative nation-building projects in the Middle East. Joe Sobran, Sam Francis, and even Pat Buchanan were shunned from establishment conservative circles, represented most prominently by Bill Buckley, because of their skepticism of Israel and their opposition to the Iraq War. Bill Buckley, with his influential magazine National Review, was a big tent conservative, but he also saw it as his mission to purge the conservative movement of what he considered fringe characters and beliefs, including the John Birch Society, along with racism and anti-Semitism. But it turned out that Pat Buchanan, Joe Sobran, Sam Francis, that wing of the conservative movement, was absolutely right about the Iraq War. I also certainly agree that we don't want to get bogged down in endless wars in the Middle East. Absolutely. But Joe Sobran, Sam Francis, and Pat Buchanan, who Nick Fuentes praises and who he models his views after, I guess kind of, they were not obsessed with Israel and the Jews the way Nick Fuentes is. Israel and our problems in the Middle East occupied, I would say, less than 10% of their brain power, probably less than 5%. Pat Buchanan was unfairly branded as anti-Semitic because he referred to the, quote, Amen Corner, which was a reference to the subservience of politicians to the Jewish lobby, most notably AIPAC. And that was really about it in terms of anything that Pat Buchanan said that could be considered anti-Semitic. And I wouldn't call it anti-Semitic at all. I would call it descriptive. Many politicians back then and today are subservient to the Jewish lobby, to the Israel lobby. Absolutely. Nick Fuentes and the anti-Israel wing are not completely wrong about this, not really wrong about that at all. The Israel lobby is very powerful and very influential, but so are other lobbies. Now, Joe Sobran did go more hardline anti-Israel after his firing from National Review by Bill Buckley. Buckley called Sobran, quote, contextually anti-Semitic, end quote. That was Buckley's criticism of Sobran, contextually anti-Semitic. So it's not like Joe Sobran was talking all the time about Israel. He was talking about a lot of things. Usually he was talking about the left and attacking the left, and he's one of the best writers out there on that. Now, my dad's view on Israel, as far as I remember, and we really didn't talk about Israel much at all, is that he was basically neutral on Israel, as am I. I'm pretty neutral on Israel. His view is basically that the fact of the matter is Israel is in the Middle East. It's there, and we have to take the situation as it is. He just kind of looked at Israel and said, there it is. That's that. He wasn't really for Israel or against Israel. And my dad did break with National Review over the Iraq War. My dad was very much against the Iraq War from day one. Now, concerning my view on Israel, I've always been of the view that we should have carved a chunk out of Germany after the war and just made that Israel. That would have been good retribution to the Germans who started 2 world wars and who did the Holocaust. That's what I thought should have happened, but that didn't happen. Now, Joe Sobran, who I was very good friends with, was pretty bitter about his firing from National Review and blamed it on the neoconservatives, who were mostly Jewish. And he did become sort of obsessed with Israel and the power of the Jewish lobby. That's kind of true in his later years. He was, for example, skeptical about the number 6 million Jews being killed in the Holocaust. He was skeptical of that number. He thought the number was more like 3 million. He would say, quote, 3 million is horrible enough, but if it's 3 million, why not say it's 3 million and not 6 million? That's what Joe would say. I've looked into this pretty carefully. The Nazis were meticulous record keepers, unlike the Russians or Mao's China. We don't really know if Stalin killed off 30 million of his own people or 60 million of his own people. We don't know if Mao killed 60 million of his own people or 80 million or 100 million of his own people. These numbers are estimates by various historians. But we know that about 3 million Jews were killed in Hitler's extermination camps. Another approximately 3 million were killed in other ways, such as shot on the spot by German soldiers or starved to death in Jewish ghettos when the Nazi troops would surround them and cut off their food and water. The number of Jews killed by the Nazis outside the extermination camps is less precise, though the Jewish people were also meticulous record keepers, knew what happened to their family members, had birth records, death records, knew the Jewish population levels in Germany before and after the Holocaust. So the 6 million number is pretty accurate. Maybe it's 5.9 million or 6.1 million, but it's pretty accurate. Hitler exterminated 45%, about 45% of the world's Jewish population. We can see that. So I had many dinners with Joe Sobran and Sam Francis. These were two of the best writers in the conservative intellectual movement. And Nick Fuentes considers these two as providing the foundational pillars for his worldview. Same with Pat Buchanan, who ran for president against George H.W. Bush in 1988. Buchanan won the New Hampshire primary on a platform of an America First foreign policy. Pat Buchanan, Joe Sobran, and Sam Francis believed that we needed to return to a fortress America, more as America was before World War II, and that we should not be getting involved in foreign wars, and certainly should not get bogged down in endless wars in the Middle East. They believed just let Israel fend for itself. They seemed plenty capable. And that was the view of George Washington, America's first president. Washington warned America against getting involved in foreign entanglements. He said this in his farewell address in 1776, quote, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. So far as I mean, we are now at liberty to do it." And until World War II, that was pretty much the American view. My view is that I'm 100% America first. I like Israel. I see Israel as really the lone outpost of civilization in the Middle East. I also think that if Israel were not located where it is now, we might have fewer problems in the Middle East. We might be less of a target of radical Islamic extremists in the Middle East. Maybe the 9/11 attack wouldn't have happened. I actually don't think that was true. Osama bin Laden was motivated by his hatred for Western civilization. He wanted the entire world to be Islamic, his brand of Islam. He saw the World Trade Center in New York City as perhaps the most prominent symbol of Western capitalism. So that was his target, along with the White House and the Pentagon. The plane that was headed for the White House, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed in Pennsylvania thanks to the heroism of Todd Beamer, and passengers who joined him fought their way into the cockpit and took on the savages. But Israel's existence was not at all central to bin Laden's motive for the 9/11 attack on America. His primary motivation was hatred for Western civilization. And the 9/11 attack very likely would have happened with or without the existence of Israel. Now, as I mentioned, my preference would have been for Israel to have just been carved out of Germany in the aftermath of World War II. But that didn't happen. So being a realist, we have to take the world as it actually is, not as we'd like it to be. And let's talk a bit about why that did not happen, carving a chunk out of Germany and making that Israel. And why at the time it made quite a bit of sense to put Israel exactly where it is now. Well, for one thing, if you're Jewish, you probably don't want to be hanging around Germany even after Hitler and the Nazis lost World War II. The Germans, after all, started 2 world wars in a very short period of time, carried out the Holocaust, and Hitler was popular in Germany. The German people were mostly on board with the Hitler program, went along with rounding up the Jews, had no problem with that. So if you're Jewish in the 1940s, you pretty much want to get as far away from Germany as possible. But also, and this is a pretty critical point, the area that is now Israel had been under Western rule, had been under European rule for more than 400 years, and had been under British rule since World War I. And before that, this region was part of the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. So that patch of land did not belong to any existing Arab country. Yes, there were about 700,000 Palestinians and Arabs living there, but under British rule. And before that, for 400 years, under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. There was also an existing Zionist movement on that patch of sand. And there were about 15,000 indigenous Jews who had been there for thousands of years. Plus, about 50,000 Zionists had moved into the area mostly because they'd been driven out of Arab countries or had fled Germany and Europe during the Holocaust or during the lead up to the Holocaust. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe even without Hitler and without the Holocaust. Many Jews also fled Germany and Europe for America. Others moved to what is now modern Israel. After World War II, in the wake of Hitler and the Holocaust, the United Nations helped create Israel by passing Resolution 181, which recommended the creation of both a Jewish country and an Arab country for the Palestinians in that area. And this resolution had the support of the United States and our allies. But the Palestinians and the Arabs rejected this resolution because they didn't want the Jews there at all. And the Palestinians have been given many opportunities to have their own country, but they've rejected every proposal that includes the existence of Israel. I don't know how you can negotiate with a group of people who have, as a condition of negotiation, that your country can no longer exist. So after UN Resolution 181, the Jewish people there moved forward and started their country, even though the Palestinians and the Arab world rejected this resolution because it included the existence of Israel. Meanwhile, the British withdrew from the region and turned that area over to the Jews, what became modern Israel. And about 600,000 Jews quickly flowed into this new country. This then triggered the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. Israel was then invaded by 5 Arab countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. And amazingly, Israel won this war decisively without material support from the United States or our allies. In fact, the United States had an embargo, a prohibition on any weapons going into the Middle East, including to Israel. So the Israelis had to raise private money to fund the war. And incredibly, the Israelis were able to win this war in about 18 months against the entire surrounding Arab world. So that was pretty incredible. Good job, Jews. Then the Arab world attempted a rematch in 1967 with the Six-Day War. By this time, there's about 1.5 million Jews living in Israel. And Israel had no trouble at all winning that war, which lasted only 6 days, which is why they call it the Six-Day War. Israel spanked the Arab world like a baby, defeated Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, with Egypt losing the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, and Lebanon losing the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The leader and primary architect of what became modern Israel was the incredible David Ben-Gurion. And about 700,000 Palestinians and Arabs were displaced by the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. So you can see why the Palestinians and Arabs who had been living in that region were pretty ticked off. But the truth is, the more advanced civilization will almost always win and dominate the less advanced people. The Native Americans here had no chance once Europe discovered the New World. We might think that's sad and unfair and unjust, but that's just the way life is. Borders of countries are constantly changing. There are no permanent borders. Those who get the land are the ones with the intelligence, the determination, and the strength to take it. That's how human history has always worked. You have no inherent right to the land that you're on. Someone stronger can always come along and take it. Your right to your property is only as valid as your ability to keep it, to hold on to it. So these very smart, determined Jews were given this patch of land by the British in the wake of the Holocaust, then defended it. Won 2 wars against the Arab world to keep that land. The Jews proved themselves to be smarter and tougher than the surrounding Arab world. It's also interesting to me that the anti-Israel wing is not equally upset about the millions of people killed and displaced by the creation of Pakistan in 1947, which is right around that same period that Israel was created. The creation of Pakistan resulted in 14 million refugees, Hindus fleeing Pakistan and Muslims fleeing India. About 2 million people died in these wars and skirmishes between India Hindus and Pakistan Muslims. By contrast, about 12,000 Arabs died in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, and about the same number died in the Six-Day War of 1967. So the Pakistan-India wars produced 10 times the number of deaths as the 2 Arab-Israeli wars. Yet the anti-Israel wing is not equally exercised about the creation of Pakistan. They focus on Israel and the Jews. And the fact of the matter is, borders change all the time. New countries are formed, old countries go away or absorbed into new countries. Empires rise and fall. This has been going on for thousands of years. Now let me touch on why I think many Christians, especially evangelical Christians, are also wrong about Israel, in my view. The founder of modern Zionism was a Jewish journalist and writer from Hungary named Theodor Herzl. Herzl founded the World Zionist Organization in 1897 for the purpose of establishing a Jewish state. And it's important to note that the purpose of this Jewish state was secular, not religious. Its purpose was to establish a safe haven for the Jewish people who had historically suffered persecution. Even before Hitler came to power, it was becoming increasingly dangerous to be Jewish in Europe. In Herzl's view, and in the view of most Jews, This Jewish state, this Jewish country, could have been located anywhere. But the preferred location, of course, was where Israel is located now for religious and cultural and historical reasons. But Israel did not need to be located where it is now, in Herzl's view. It just made sense to put Israel there because that patch of sand did not belong to anyone. Well, it belonged to the British, but the British gave that patch of sand to the Jews. Most Americans don't realize that modern Israel was never a religious country. It's always been a secular country. The people of Israel are mostly Jewish by ethnicity. Judaism is an ethno-religion. Jewishness means two different things, or it can mean two different things. It can mean the religion. Anyone can adopt the religion and become Jewish, and there are ethnic Jews. So you can be religiously Jewish, ethnically Jewish, or both. Israel is a place for ethnic Jews to be safe from persecution. That was its purpose. Now, many Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, see modern Israel as God's chosen people and the country as specifically ordained by God as we speed toward the end of times. And they cite this verse here in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, which says of the ancient Jews, quote, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples of the earth shall be blessed through you," end quote. But this is an out-of-context misreading of that text, in my opinion. God was talking to Abraham here about 4,000 years ago. At the time that Bible verse was written, ancient Israel did not even exist yet. And this text was not talking about a country, it was talking about this group of people, God's chosen people. And God made a covenant with this group of people. But to say that this group of people living in Israel today are this same group of people of 4,000 years ago is a stretch, in my opinion. The majority of people in modern Israel today don't even follow the Jewish religion. And of course, there's a lot of interracial marriage. About 21% of the people living in Israel are not even Jewish. So equating the modern secular state of Israel with ancient Israel of the Old Testament is just a misreading of the text, in my opinion. I could be wrong, of course. I don't know the mind of God. But if we Christians are going to follow the dictates of the Old Testament literally, why are we eating bacon, sausage, and ham sandwiches? In fact, if we were to strictly follow Old Testament laws, America would look a lot more like Iran does today. Men would be free to have many wives. But this belief by some evangelical Christians that modern Israel is the same chosen people as the Israelites of the Old Testament leads some Republican leaders to make crazy statements like this.
We should be doing three things. One, support Israel, whatever they need, whenever they need it, no questions asked.
It is not that Israel needs America. America needs Israel.
No, we don't actually need Israel more than Israel needs America. And Israel's problems are not necessarily America's problems. Nor do we need to take a position on every conflict that's going on in the Middle East, or every conflict that's going on between Israel and somebody else. So that's my basic view of Israel. We are allies with Israel, in a general sense. Now, I do have great admiration for the history of Israel and the Jewish people, and I like the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. I think he's awesome in the same way that I thought Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were awesome. But Israel's problems do not automatically become America's problems. However, given Israel's existence, given that Israel does exist, does it make sense to be allies with Israel against Islamic terrorist organizations and terrorist states like Iran? The United States currently sends about $3.8 billion a year to Israel. I certainly think it's debatable whether we should be doing that. I lean towards no. I'm pretty much against all foreign aid. It should all be cut off. Usually foreign aid from the United States just turns dictators into billionaires. But this $3.8 billion is a relatively small amount of money in the scheme of a $7 trillion federal budget. It costs us about $13 billion to build just one aircraft carrier. Now, the way I view Israel is that it's basically just an enormous U.S. military base in the Middle East that is more or less self-sustaining, well, except for the $3.8 billion that Israel doesn't really need. And Israel is a self-actuating, self-sustaining military base that can make its own decisions. And Israel's usefulness to the United States was perfectly illustrated in the recent war with Iran, the recent conflict with Iran that lasted about 1 week. For more than 10 years, President Trump had been saying that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. In fact, someone on X put together a 16-minute video of President Trump saying this over and over again for about a decade.
They cannot have a nuclear weapon. That was the only thing. The one thing I said, you cannot have. I just didn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I said, we're going to make a great deal. Everybody's going to be happy. You're going to be rich as hell again. Everything's going to be great. But you cannot have a nuclear weapon.
You can't let Iran have nuclear weapons.
Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Very simple. The main thing is Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. That was my main thing. The deal was a simple deal. It cannot have that nuclear capability.
So President Trump gave Iran 60 days to sign a deal pledging to abandon its quest for nuclear weapons. Iran did not sign. So on day 61, this happened. Israel began strikes. In fact, Israel did 90% of the job disabling Iran's nuclear weapons development program. And then we did a bit of mop-up by dropping 3 Moab bombs on Iran's nuclear weapons development facilities, its underground nuclear weapons facilities. So yes, we send Israel about $3.8 billion a year. Maybe that should end. I'd be for that. But without Israel, it would have cost us at least $100 billion, probably more, to take out Iran's nuclear weapons facilities. It would have been a major military operation for us. But Israel is right there with a sophisticated army and air force. So having Israel there doing 90% of the work for us is very cost effective. Also, Iran attacked Israel first, so Israel is perfectly justified to strike back against Iran and disable Iran's nuclear weapons development program. Israel also has tremendous intelligence capabilities. We would have a very tough time knowing what's happening in the Middle East without Israel there on the ground. And you have to wonder what Iran was thinking when it decided to attack Israel. Does Iran not know about the 6-day war where Israel defeated the entire Arab world in 6 days? Then didn't Iran see what Israel did to Hezbollah? Hezbollah is the Iran-backed terrorist organization that was attacking Israel. The Israeli military hacked into about 5,000 Hezbollah pagers and blew them up, taking out about 2,500 or 3,000 Hezbollah terrorist fighters. That was incredible. But I think this was maybe my favorite part of the military operation. Israel hacked into Iran's military communication system to make a fake phone call to dozens of Iran's top military leaders, including Iran's top generals, lured them to a supposedly secure bunker, for a military briefing. Israel then blew up these Iranian military leaders with a single missile strike, including 4 of Iran's top generals. And that was on the first day of Israel's attack, one day after President Trump's 60-day deadline to sign the nuclear deal expired. Now, I'm certainly very much against the neoconservative project of endless wars in the Middle East and nation-building projects. And Israel's existence actually allows us not to be bogged down in the Middle East, allows us to keep tabs on the Middle East and project power as needed. For example, disabling Iran's nuclear weapons development program. And by the way, that was very popular with the American people. Let's hear even CNN on this.
I feel like there's more support for Donald Trump's positions than is comically acknowledged. Oppose Iran getting a nuclear weapon. I mean, look at this. 79% of adults agree on that. They agree with Donald Trump. Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon. 83% of Republicans, 79% of independents, 79% of Democrats. When you get 79% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans agreeing on anything, you know that that position is the very clear majority in this country. And so the American public is with Donald Trump. They definitely oppose Iran getting nuclear weapons.
And I basically think that President Trump has it just about exactly right. Strike when needed, then get out. That approach is very different from endless Middle East war quagmires. But just because President Trump doesn't want to get bogged down in endless wars in the Middle East does not make him an isolationist. After all, President Trump launched 2 attacks on Syria during his first term, one in 2017, another in 2018.
American warships launched cruise missiles before dawn local time. The Pentagon hopes the attack made it much harder for Syria's president to use chemical weapons on his own people.
U.S. warships in the Mediterranean Sea launched 59 missiles. They pounded an air base in western Syria.
And we now know he will not hesitate to use military force to send a dramatic message to Syria's President Bashar Assad.
From a U.S. warship, one of 105 missiles fired through the night into Syria.
During his first term, President Trump dropped the 20,000-pound Moab bomb on the ISIS tunnel network in Afghanistan. He then proceeded to wipe out ISIS, which rose up and took control in the Middle East about the size of Indiana under Obama. Trump killed the founder and leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in 2019. Trump also killed Iran's top terrorist general, Qasem Soleimani, in 2020 because Soleimani had orchestrated attacks that had killed more than 1,000 Americans. Here's Trump taking out Soleimani with a drone strike. Just recently, President Trump killed top leaders of the Houthi terrorist organization in Yemen who were attacking commercial ships in the Red Sea. The Houthis are a terrorist organization armed and funded by Iran. Here's that video. Wow, wouldn't want to be them. But here's what the Houthis were doing to commercial ships. So President Trump did this to them. So now the Houthis have stopped attacking commercial ships, and we aren't hearing much from Iran either. Anyone who voted for President Trump in 2024 thinking that he was some kind of isolationist just wasn't paying attention. But President Trump believes that military engagements should be short-term, quick strikes, then get out. That's the Trump doctrine. And by the way, when Israel wanted to keep attacking Iran and bring about regime change, President Trump told Netanyahu to back off. That tells me that President Trump is in charge of U.S. foreign policy, not Benjamin Netanyahu. President Trump is the man in charge. He's telling Israel what's acceptable. He's telling Israel what to do, not vice versa. Israel is like a self-sustaining, self-actuating U.S. military base in the Middle East. That's how I view Israel. And I'd much rather have Israel on the front lines in the Middle East than us. That's how I view Israel from an America First perspective. But also, Israel does have its own interests that have little to do with the United States. Not every problem that Israel has to become America's problem. And I do agree with the principle that George Washington, the founder of our country, laid out in his farewell address, that we need to avoid foreign entanglements. As a general principle, I absolutely agree with that. We should get out of the United Nations and every international organization. I don't think we have much in common with Europe anymore. I'm all for getting out of NATO. Let Europe fend for itself. We really get nothing from Europe except criticized. Europe is not much help to us. I basically believe in Fortress America, but we do occasionally have to strike the bad guys. Now, most people think of Thomas Jefferson as a small government guy, right? Against a big federal government. But as president, Thomas Jefferson did destroy the Barbary Coast pirates in Africa because they were disrupting shipping lanes and disrupting commerce. He sent the U.S. Marines to Tripoli and imposed a naval blockade around Tripoli because that's where the pirates were based. So yes, that's why we have a military, to protect America's interests. And of course, we found out during World War II that we just can't turn a blind eye to the rest of the world, or the bad guys are going to take over. If we abandon the Middle East completely, the bad guys will take over. That's why we want Israel there keeping an eye on things. But our military actions have to always be based on America's interest, not anybody else's interest, not Israel's interest. Now, let's just say that Nick Fuentes is right, just for the sake of argument, that the Jews really do have these superpowers and control everything. That's what Nick seems to think. That's not true, not even close to true, or Kamala Harris would have selected Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro as her running mate, as her vice presidential running mate in 2024. But let's just say that Nick is right, just for the sake of argument here. How horrible would that actually be? Israel is actually a great place to live. It's a Western-style democracy. You can be LGBTQ, you can be anything you want to be in Israel. And if by some fluke, by some fantasy land scenario, Israel were actually to take control of the world, it would not be like living under Nazism or communism. It would be pretty much like living in the United States. Maybe a bit better because less crime. The reason we fought a Cold War is we didn't want to live under communism. The reason we fought Hitler and the Nazis is we didn't want to live under Nazism. We also don't want to live under Islam. But Israel is a civilized democracy, respects human rights. Israel is an advanced modern society. It's pretty much like us. And I chuckle when I see Palestinian flags being flown at gay pride parades. If any of these people ventured into Gaza, they'd be thrown off a building. In fact, if you're any kind of Westerner and venture into Gaza, there's a pretty good chance you're going to end up dead. And if you're a female dressed like this, well, you'd better not venture into Gaza. Another area where I have a strong disagreement with Nick is on the topic of race. Nick calls himself a white identitarian or a white nationalist. Doesn't call himself a white supremacist. He's a white nationalist. He's proud of his whiteness, which is kind of funny because Nick has a Hispanic last name. But okay, Nick is a white identitarian or a white nationalist. Let's hear Nick state his view on this in this interview with Glenn Greenwald.
I don't know that the immigrants ever fully and really assimilate. You look at Black Americans, for example, they've been here for 400 years. Are African Americans assimilated? I would argue that they really represent a kind of distinct identity from white America. There's white America, there's Black America. Those are two completely different worlds. They talk differently, they act differently, different culture, vote differently. And you could argue, have they even assimilated? It's been 400 years. Obviously, they have a unique experience.
And here we get into a bit more detail on Nick's views on race in his interview with Candace Owens.
You do have ideas that there shouldn't be interracial marriage. I've seen those clips. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, it's not that I don't think there should be interracial marriage. I'm Catholic, so as you know, it's not a sin to be in an interracial marriage or relationship. But I am racist, I would say. I believe in the races. I believe there are white people and Black people and Hispanics and Asians, and I think that it's a core part of our identity. It's who we are. And there's like this conservative reflex to say, we're colorblind. Race doesn't mean anything. And, Pat Buchanan said this. He said, it's not everything, but it isn't nothing. And I definitely lean more towards the latter, which is it really is a core part of who we are. Our culture, our heritage, our ancestors, our customs, all of it. It's not that I don't think that two people can fall in love from different races. Of course they can. And they have throughout history. And the races have mixed throughout history and assimilated. But for someone like myself, I always say on my show, it's just my value. I want to marry someone that looks like me, that comes from a similar background, because I want my kids to look like me. I want my grandkids to look like me.
But sorry, I just want to make sure, did you say I'm a racialist or I'm a racist?
For a long time, I would say I'm racialist. Now I just say I'm racist.
Okay, so when you say you're racist, because these definitions get changed around, racist, anti-Semitism gets expanded. What do you mean when you say I'm a racist? Because I think most people watching this would go, if you are a racist in the traditional sense of the term, why are you on this podcast, right? Wouldn't you just go, you know what, Candace is Black and she's therefore I don't want to speak to her.
Yeah, and I'm using it. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek. I mean, for the purpose of understanding, I'd say my views are I'm a racialist. But I do think that we need to deconstruct this idea of racism in the sense that, look, you're Black, I'm white. It is what it is. For my entire life, people have been walking around on eggshells about the subject of race, about white people being racist. Can I say this? Can I say that? Can I have this opinion? Look, sometimes we have racist feelings. Racist feelings like I want to live in a white neighborhood. I don't want to live in a Black neighborhood. If they were all like you, obviously it'd be a different story. But when we think of a Black neighborhood, we know what that means.
So do you think it's literally, well, this is just what a Black person is when they come out? Or do you think that post welfare, LBJ, Great Society, this is what Black Americans have become, and I have a right to respond to that and say that as a white man, I don't want to live there?
Well, I think it's more nature than people would like to believe. There's this classic tension of, is it nature, is it nurture, is it cultural, or is it intrinsic, is it racial? And I've always been on the latter side of this among conservatives. Conservatives like to say it's all culture. Black America is the way it is because of hip hop music and the Great Society and that kind of stuff. And I think the uncomfortable reality is a big part of it is intrinsic. One of the big arguments against the abolition of slavery in the 1860s is that, when Europeans colonized Africa, they hadn't discovered the wheel. There's no two-story buildings. There's no writing. There's no written language. Missionaries had to go to Africa in the last century and invent it for the African people because there's no recorded history. They didn't have writing.
A few points on this. It's not really true that these tribes in sub-Saharan Africa had not come up with the wheel. It's just that wheels for the purpose of transport and carrying heavy things is not especially useful in dense jungle. For wheels to be useful, you need roads, or at least flat, firm ground. The wheel, for example, would not be especially useful in the Arctic ice and snows. Sleds are better in the Arctic. And the people of sub-Saharan Africa did have potter's wheels and wheels on toys for children. So it's not that they didn't have the wheel. The jungle is just not a good place for carts and wagons. Jungle people lived near rivers and used canoes for transport because that was more efficient. And in terms of written language, well, before the printing press was invented in the 15th century, 99% of white people were illiterate. The only ones who could read or write were clergy, some royalty, and a few elites. Without the printing press, people relied on oral tradition for stories and to preserve history, and that was true for tribal people. And Ethiopians, who are sub-Saharan Africans, did have wheels that they used for transport. They did have wagons and carts. But yes, sub-Saharan Africa was behind other civilizations, such as the Egyptians in North Africa. And one of my big themes is how fragile and rare civilization is. We had the Roman Empire, which collapsed into the Dark Ages, which lasted 600 years. Were people who lived in the Dark Ages dumber than the Romans? The Romans did have flushing toilets and sophisticated plumbing, tech that we lost and then did not reinvent until the 18th century, 1400 years later. Is that because the people of that area became genetically dumber? Human progress can only happen if you have a system and a structure in place that makes human progress possible. You need a money system, a financial system. But also, human progress only occurs due to breakthroughs in the work of a few people. How many Thomas Edisons are there? How many Elon Musks? Not many. These are 1 in a billion type people. Yet we kind of ride along in the wake of breakthroughs and the work of a few. We're just kind of along for the ride. I mean, we haven't seen any innovation at Apple since Steve Jobs left the building. No new products developed at Apple since Steve Jobs. They just keep trying to make the old products, Steve Jobs' products, marginally better. Plus, where would our civilization be without Aristotelian logic plus Christianity, which brought in respect for individual rights? So civilization is both fragile and extremely rare, which is the theme of Joseph Conrad's classic novel, Heart of Darkness. Also, Lord of the Flies. The truth is, we can revert to savagery at any time. And for proof of this, just look at the Middle East. Iran was an awesome civilized place just 50 years ago under the Shah of Iran. There were nightclubs. Tehran was a modern cosmopolitan city. The women there looked like this. Then Iran reverted to Dark Ages style barbarism. So civilization must not be taken for granted. It can be lost in an instant. Sub-Saharan Africa is actually the norm, not the exception. We're just lucky enough to have been born into this civilization. Elon Musk and Thomas Edison could not have succeeded without civilization, could not have succeeded in sub-Saharan Africa. But if you put sub-Saharan Africans in civilization, they can succeed, and they do succeed. Civilization must be protected because it's so rare and fragile. Okay, let's continue with Nick and Candace.
So Egypt is not in Africa.
Well, Egypt is a different race. Africans. When I say African, I'm saying sub-Saharan African.
Sub-Saharan, okay.
Black people yeah, because it is a different race. In sub-Saharan Africa, and Europeans did not penetrate that until late 19th century, they didn't have any of this. To the extent that you have infrastructure in Africa, it's from the Muslims in the Sahel, in the Maghreb, in northern Africa, where the Arabs colonized. And then you had, Carthage and Egypt, you had ancient civilizations. But sub-Saharan Africa, they didn't have that. You take these people out of that land and put them here, and they're enslaved people. You let them free in a modern, liberal republic, they're not going to succeed. It's not going to go well for them. And that was one of the arguments against abolition. People said if you free them without any assimilation, without any kind of process for them to be acclimated, they're going to die. And that's exactly what happened. Many of the bottom 10% of the lowest IQ Africans just died off for generations. And it had a, pardon the expression, but it had a eugenic effect because over time, if the If the weakest are dying off, that's one argument for why blacks in America have a standard deviation higher IQ than the blacks in sub-Saharan Africa.
I would argue that we see IQ differences in backwater white communities, such as in parts of Appalachia, the Ozarks, or among Cajuns in Louisiana. The reason you find lower IQs among tribal people, people living in the jungles, or among tight-knit white communities in rural, remote areas, is that they're mating with their relatives. There's a lot of inbreeding in these tribes over generations and centuries, so there's a smaller gene pool. This applies to any isolated group, regardless of race, such as in Appalachia, the Ozarks, or in Cajun communities in Louisiana. In the Ozarks and parts of Missouri and Arkansas, we see average IQs up to 15 points below what we see for the general population in America. And to get the point, watch the movie Deliverance if you haven't seen it.
I bet you can squeal. I bet you can squeal like a pig. Oh, which squeal? Squeal now. Squeal. Whee! Gotta get down there, boy. Hey, them britches down.
So this low IQ phenomenon is not limited to the people of sub-Saharan Africa. Plus, adoption studies show that IQs can go up 15 points when children are removed from impoverished, dysfunctional social settings and placed with affluent families. So skin color is really not any kind of deciding factor. Plus, I'm just not sure how accurate IQ tests are for tribal people in remote areas. So take American blacks. As a group, they're among the least successful ethnic group in America. They trail Jews, Asians, whites, Hispanics, and Native Americans. Is this because of the color of their skin? Or is this because of the gangster rap hood culture that many of them are raised in? Also, the victim mindset that they're brainwashed into by the schools and the media and the Democrat Party. By contrast, black immigrants from Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and elsewhere in Africa perform very well in America. The median household income for American blacks in 2023 was $52,000, but immigrants from Nigeria arrive in America pretty much with nothing typically, but have a median household income of $80,000, so $28,000 more than American blacks. And immigrants from Kenya are doing extremely well, with a median household income of $93,000. That's compared to a median household income for white Americans of $89,000. So Kenyans are doing better than white Americans. And Ethiopians in America have a median household income of $90,000, so about the same or a little bit better than whites. Here are some more median household incomes for black immigrants. Zimbabweans, $95,000 a year. Cameroonians, $85,000 a year. Ghanaians, $82,000 a year. Liberians, $80,000 a year. So skin color doesn't seem to be a factor at all. Something has gone wrong with the American black community that has not gone wrong with black immigrants in America. And I believe that what's gone wrong is the glorification of the hood and gangster rap culture, which doesn't exist among black immigrants like from Nigeria, Kenya, and Ethiopia, which are doing as well or better than whites in America. How about other ethnic groups? Median household income for Jewish Americans is $97,000. For Asians, it's $112,000. And for immigrants from India, it's $151,000. So immigrants from India doing best in America. Asians doing second best, better than Jewish Americans. So that means whites trail Indians from India, Asians, Jews, Kenyans, and Ethiopians, and are about the same as Nigerians. Among all Hispanics in America, median household income is $62,000, so 20% better than American blacks. But also, not all Hispanic immigrant groups the same. Mexicans are at $63,800, Cubans at $72,000. Of course, Cubans are conservative. Central Americans are at $60,000. Venezuelans are at $78,000 for median household income. 70% of Venezuelans voted for Trump in 2024. So we need more Venezuelans, just not more Venezuelan gangs. Puerto Ricans are at $58,000, so lowest among Hispanic groups. South Americans are at $80,000 median household income, so almost as high as whites. So all Hispanic groups are doing significantly better than Black Americans. And many Hispanic groups are doing almost as well as whites, including Venezuelan immigrants and immigrants from South America. So let's review. Median household income for whites trails Indians from India, Asians, Jews, Kenyans, and Ethiopians. So where's the white privilege? So immigrants from India, by far the best, at around $150,000 median household income. But religious Jews, religious Orthodox Jews, are also up at around $150,000 median household income, whereas non-religious Jews are no different from whites in terms of median household income. So I found that pretty interesting. If you're a religious Orthodox Jew, you're doing more than 50% better in terms of median household income than secular Jews. And sadly, American blacks are giving worldwide blacks a bad reputation. 51% of murders in America are committed by American blacks, despite being only 13% of the American population. But violent crime among immigrant blacks from Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia is just 1/4 of what it is for white Americans. So almost no violent crime among these black immigrant groups from Africa. In fact, if you talk to black immigrants from Africa, they want absolutely nothing to do with American blacks and the gangster rap hood culture. So really, the color of your skin, your race, has nothing to do with any of this. I believe the biggest driver of high crime rates among American blacks, in contrast to immigrant blacks from Africa, is the glorification of violence by the gangster rap hood culture. Now, of course, American blacks who have been brainwashed by the media, the schools, and the Democrat Party will say that slavery is their problem. Slavery that ended more than 150 years ago. And of course, slavery used to be the norm throughout the world, still is in much of the world. Africa not only had slavery back then, but continues to have slavery today. And the British colonists, they bought slaves from black African slave traders and brought them here. So that excuse really doesn't hold up, does it? But also, American blacks were rising and really in pretty good shape in the 1940s and 1950s before even all the civil rights laws were passed. Now, of course, the racist Jim Crow era laws in the South were terrible and had to be eradicated. But blacks in America were succeeding despite all that, despite all the racist obstacles, despite the so-called systemic racism. Median black household income in America rose 40% from 1940 to 1960. And by the way, that's in constant dollars. That's before we had all this money printing starting in 1971 when we went off the gold standard. So that's a real 40% increase in median household income for black people in America. And most blacks in America in the 1950s were Republican because of Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves. And the archetype black American in the 1940s through the early 1960s was Joe Louis and Willie Mays, both Republicans, by the way, and both heroes in the black community. Here was Joe Louis's family. Joe Louis served in World War II. He was a patriot. And here's Willie Mays' family. I was a huge fan of Willie Mays, one of the greatest all-round baseball players of all time. And Joe Louis held the heavyweight boxing title for 12 straight years. He was probably the greatest heavyweight fighter of all time during those 12 years. And here's what Harlem looked like in the 1950s. Blacks all dressed well, looking sharp. Harlem in the 1940s and 1950s was a cultural epicenter. And really, the Renaissance in Harlem began in the 1920s, not long after the end of slavery, not long after the end of the Civil War. Harlem in the 1940s and 1950s had vibrant businesses, strong churches, and a solid middle class. And here was black music in the 1950s and early 1960s.
Watch me now. Hey, work, work. Woo! I'm working out, baby. Work, work. Well, you driving me crazy. I don't want nobody to love me. Leave me alone and let me be lonely.
And Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican, of course, won 60% of the black vote in 1956. I mean, imagine if black American culture was still like this.
Sweet and kind, mine, all mine. Treats me good like a lover should and makes me love him.
This would be great for blacks, and it would be great for America as a whole. And this was a period that was only 40 to 70 years removed from slavery. Today, we're 150 years removed from slavery. Something has obviously gone seriously wrong with large segments of Black American culture. 51% of the murders in America are committed by Black Americans, who represent just 13% of the population. So 51% of the murders are committed by 13% of the population. Obviously, something is wrong. The question is, what went wrong? It wasn't like this in the 1940s and 1950s in Black American culture. In fact, back then, violent crime rates among American blacks was lower than among whites. And many conservatives lay the blame for this change on President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society welfare programs that incentivized single motherhood and family breakdown. That was certainly a contributing factor, but I would say a much bigger factor is the glorification of violence among American blacks in the hood and gangster rap culture that just doesn't exist in the immigrant black culture. I also blame the brainwashing of Black Americans into a victim mindset by the schools and the media. And to get a sense of what young people are learning in the schools and colleges today, let's listen to what this young lady has to say.
So let's talk about where the word good morning originated from. Good morning. All right, so during slavery times, when the women used to mourn about their child being taken away and sold to a different slave master, or if one of the family members did something that resulted into them getting whipped or killed, most of these things used to happen in the evening time, when a child was sold off or somebody was getting whipped for something. The black women used to cry all night behind it. Not even just the women, the black people in general, all the black slaves, male or female. When something happened to a family member or a close friend or anything, they used to cry all night behind it. And when the slaves used to cry about what happened all night long, the white slave masters, the oppressors, will wake up in the morning time and they'll tell the slaves, "Did you have a good morning?" Basically, did you have a good cry out? Did you do enough crying last night because of what happened to their family member a day prior? So the white oppressors came up with good morning as a mockery towards black people.
No, actually, the phrase good morning was part of Middle English. We find it used in the 1400s. But young Black Americans are taught by the schools and by the media and by the Democrat Party that they can't succeed in America because of slavery and because of systemic racism. Well, if you're taught that you can't succeed because of your skin color, you're going to grow up with a lot of anger and resentment toward white people. And that is not a formula for success. But the fact is, immigrants from Africa are succeeding. And American blacks were succeeding in the 1940s and 1950s. So skin color is clearly not the issue. Now, when I hear American blacks complaining that they can't succeed or have a lot of trouble succeeding in America because of slavery and systemic racism, I find that really rich. Many Asians arrive in America with nothing, not even knowing the language, but they're actually doing better as a group than white Americans. My wife Wanda is a perfect example of this. She's Laotian. She, her mom, and her siblings escaped from Laos in 1978 after the communists took over. She and her family took different routes out. She and her mom walked through the jungle for many days, made it across the Mekong River to Thailand. Wanda was age 13 at the time. She and her mom got separated in the jungle. Wanda walked through the jungle for many days, finally found her way to a refugee camp in Thailand. Her mom and siblings also found their way to the same refugee camp. They all knew roughly where it was. And her dad did not come along. He stayed in Laos. He didn't want to come. Wanda, her mom, and her siblings stayed in that refugee camp in Thailand for 18 months. They were then brought to the United States. Wanda arrived here in San Francisco owning 2 dresses and 1 pair of sandals. They were then located in Maryland, where there's a strong Laotian community. But Wanda's mom had a stroke soon after they arrived. So Wanda effectively raised herself here. Her mom was bedridden for 20 years before she passed. Wanda and her siblings took care of her during that period, during those 20 years. Her mom couldn't speak. Wanda was placed in the public school in 9th grade, not knowing any English. Throughout high school, she also worked 3 jobs to bring money in. She worked at the school, she also worked in a restaurant at night, and she worked in a nursing home on weekends. She graduated from high school with a B+ average. She then took some classes at a local community college, Montgomery County Community College, to learn how to be a secretary. Wanda's Laotian name is Vondalone, but she Americanized it to Wanda because she wanted to fit into America. And she got hired by Geico to do data entry because she could type 120 words per minute without errors, or pretty much without errors. And while she was doing that, she took more courses at community college to learn how to become a legal secretary. And she was promoted to the legal department at Geico, where she became a legal secretary. And she was the employee of the month 5 times for the entire Geico corporation. And while at Geico, on weekends, she learned real estate by working for the most successful real estate agent in the Washington, D.C. area. And she started buying rental properties, which we still own today. She oversees 22 tenants. So yeah, American blacks can blame slavery 150 years ago for their problems, but look at the obstacles Wanda had to overcome to succeed in America. She escaped communism, arrived here with nothing, not knowing the language, and essentially had to raise herself because she had no parents on hand to guide her. Her dad stayed behind in Laos, and her mom had a stroke almost soon after they arrived, I think within a year after they arrived. Wanda did not complain. She was thrilled to be here. In fact, Wanda wonders how America became the most powerful country in the world. She thinks most Americans are soft, lazy, weak, and complain too much. Wanda's brother became a multimillionaire real estate investor. Again, coming from absolutely nothing, less than nothing. He just arrived here with Wanda not knowing any English and got to work. So I blame the social dysfunction in Black America on the culture in which they're raised in, this gangster rap hood culture. But of course, there's also plenty of social dysfunction in some white communities. There's basically no violent crime among Asians. There's almost no violent crime among immigrants from Africa. In fact, if you talk to black immigrants from Africa, they don't want anything to do with American blacks. The problem is the culture. That's why Harlem in the 1940s and 1950s was a happening place. If American blacks reject the gangster rap culture and go back to the Harlem culture of the 1940s and early 1960s, and reject this victim mindset, this poisonous victim mindset, well, you can get back on track and succeed like black immigrants from Africa are massively succeeding in America. Again, Nick, if you see this, I'd love to sit down with you and discuss these subjects with you. We only live about 15 minutes apart from each other in a western Chicago suburb, and I'm interested in just more of a discussion, not a debate. Just sit down and discuss these issues. And I'm not going to be getting you with gotcha questions or some kind of ambush interview like what Candace did. I'd just like to get some of your thoughts and push you on some of these topics. And the issues I'd like to discuss is your belief that Israel and the Jews are basically running everything in some kind of coordinated way. Now, in fairness, Nick would probably say that Jewish actions don't have to be explicitly coordinated because they act as a tribe. And there's certainly truth to that. People tend to be tribal. We have Jewish communities, black communities, Cuban communities, Chinatown, Italian neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods, Wanda's Laotian community, etc. And one of the great achievements of America is that we're a country where the tribes tend to get along, unlike almost everywhere else in the world. I believe that Jewish people are influential because they happen to be very smart and achievement-oriented. And I certainly agree with you that there's a strong Jewish lobby, most notably AIPAC and the ADL, Anti-Defamation League. But I also think that the Jewish community is very fragmented. There are conservative Jews, leftist Jews, religious Jews, and secular Jews. Interesting, the religious Jews are doing a lot better than the secular Jews. I like the religious Jews the best. The secular Jews tend to be left. I'm a fan of conservative Jews, not a fan of leftist Jews. And I can say the same thing about whites and blacks and Asians, Native Americans. I'm a fan of conservatives of any race. And I'm not a fan of leftists of any race. And also, I don't think you have to be any particular brand of conservative. I was very good friends with Joe Sobran, Pat Buchanan, Sam Francis. Agreed with them on 90% of the stuff. My only criteria really for being on my team is being very pro-America, America first. If honest liberals who are willing to have an honest discussion like Anna Kasparian or a John Fetterman want to join my team, I'm happy to welcome them, even if we don't agree on a lot of things. I'm more of a big tent conservative, the way Ronald Reagan was. He won 49 states. I believe winning politics is the politics of addition, not subtraction, not purity tests. And you don't have to agree with me on everything. I just want you to be pro-America, America first. And in terms of racial views, I'm happy to have anyone of any color on my team. Now, you would like to have a white dominant America, maybe a white only America, but that's going to be pretty tough when the fertility rate among white Americans stands at 1.5 babies per female, which is well below the population replacement rate, which I think is around 2.4. Fewer whites are marrying today. Only half are married today compared to 3/4 in the 1960s, which obviously means fewer kids. And married white people are having 1 or 2 children. This means that whites are literally disappearing from the face of the earth by choice. And that's no one's fault but whites. And the idea that a more white population equals more conservative policies, a more America first political outcome, is equally preposterous. Look at states like Vermont and Maine with 90% plus white populations. They're among the most liberal states in the country. Oregon is like 75% white. It's one of the most liberal states in the country. Florida, by contrast, is less than 50% white. I think it's 49% white, 30% Hispanic. But Florida has become a pretty reliably Republican state. Also, look at Europe. Is Scandinavia conservative? How about Germany, France, the UK? Europe is literally committing suicide thanks to white guilt. Europe's economy was about the same size as the U.S. economy when the European Union was formed in 1993 to counter the United States on commerce and trade. Today, Europe's GDP is about 2/3 the size of ours. So Europe has literally lost about 1/3 of its GDP in relation to us since 1993. And this is happening because of very poor decision-making by whites. So no thanks to more of that. I don't think race has much to do with anything. It's the culture in which people are raised in, not skin color and not even where they start off economically. One of the biggest problems for conservatives is the voting behavior of college-educated white females. Apparently, white women are more subject to brainwashing from the schools than males are. College-educated white women. This is like the worst group for Republicans. Meanwhile, my Asian wife is to the right of me. Actually, well to the right of me. When Wanda first heard Obama speak in 2008, she told me, he sounds exactly like the communists who took over my country, Laos. Same propaganda about free healthcare, free food, free housing, and so on. We need more Wandas, not more college-educated white women. The faster college-educated white females are bred out of the gene pool, the better. And that looks like it's happening anyway, as leftist college-educated white women are not marrying and not having babies. They're also aborting their baby if they get pregnant. My recommendation to young males out there is find a good non-white woman to marry, or a working-class white woman. Avoid a college-educated white woman like the plague. In fact, avoid college-educated women like the plague, period, no matter what color they are. Find someone like Wanda. That's how you have a happy life. And my view is that 90% of Americans should not go to college at all, which is a massive scam, a ripoff, and a waste of time. And I say that as somebody who graduated from Dartmouth. My advice is just learn a marketable skill and get to work. Perhaps start a business if you're entrepreneurially inclined. What you definitely don't want to do is go into massive student loan debt for a gender studies degree or a theater degree. Trump has it right. He transformed the Republican Party, which had been the party kind of the banking class and of Wall Street, he transformed the Republican Party into a populist America First party of the working class. Is Trump doing everything perfectly, everything I would like him to be doing? No, of course not. Nobody's perfect, but he's doing pretty well. This brings me to my third big disagreement with Nick. Nick does not want any immigration. But this would literally mean national suicide, given that the fertility rate among whites is 1.5 babies per woman. Whites are not having babies anywhere close to the population replacement level. Elon Musk calls the population collapse among more affluent people the single biggest threat to civilization's survival. Apparently, the richer people get, the fewer babies they have. Without immigration into America, we would have a population collapse in America, which would produce an economic collapse. Our economy is built on debt. We have a $37 trillion national debt. Our entire economy is built on an increasing population. The Social Security system would collapse without more workers paying into the Social Security system because it is a Ponzi scheme. Now, if I had to start over, I would not have a Social Security system. Wouldn't go $37 trillion into debt either. But you have to take the world as it is, right? We're realists. So if we have a decrease in the population, a decrease in the size of the workforce, you're going to have an economic collapse. What we need is controlled immigration, immigration that adjusts in accordance with America's economic needs. And it should obviously be an immigration system based on merit. Also, that aligns with America's values. Only allow immigrants in who share our values. And immigration levels should be adjusted in accordance with America's needs. If the unemployment rate is high, we shut off immigration. In times of full employment, we increase immigration levels. We should also have a law that says immigrants are ineligible for welfare for at least 10 years, so that we only get productive immigrants, immigrants who are contributing to America. And maybe my biggest complaint about you, Nick, is you spend very little of your brain power going after the left. You spend almost all of your brain power coming after those on the right, on the conservative side. Now, I have no problem with critiquing conservatives, but maybe do that with 20% of your commentary, not with 90% of it. And overall, I'd just like to see you get off your obsession with the Jews and off the topic of race and aim your intellectual firepower at the real threat, and that's the left. So, Nick, DM me on X if you'd like to sit down and discuss any of this. Well, that's all I have for you now. Be sure to comment. Love reading your comments. I get a lot of ideas from your comments. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, share, and hit the notifications button so that we can overcome suppression by the algorithm, because the suppression is real. Here are a couple of books of mine that you might want to check out, both available on Amazon in all the formats. One is Bitcoin, A Beginner's Guide, Your Off-Ramp from the Corrupt Political System and Protection from Economic Collapse. And the other book is Win Life, Success Skills Schools Don't Teach. Thanks for listening. Hope to see you back here next time.